By American standards, Boston's an older city with no shortage of books about its history, even at the neighborhood level. When it comes to the history of the South End, our guest has covered some of the ground that's been covered before, but in a different way. The result is a timeline and anecdotal history called Once Upon a Neighborhood. To tell us about it is the author and longtime neighborhood resident, Alison Barnet. Thank you very much for being with us, Alison.
I'm glad to be here.
I want to start with your history in the South End. It's not just about how long you've been there, but you have people in your family going back a ways who were there as well, don't you?
Well, really just one, my great-grandfather. And the first book that I wrote was about him. He was a playwright. And he lived in the South End as a young person for 20 years or so. But that was in the 1860s. So...
And what was the neighborhood like when you discovered it? Because you came here, like a lot of people in Boston, as a college student. What drew you to the South End?
Nothing, actually. I was a transfer student into BU, and they had no room in the dorms, and it was the 60s, and I was a woman, so I had to live in protected housing. So they gave me this list, and I think the very bottom was Franklin Square House in the South End on East Newton Street. It was the cheapest, and, I just went there not knowing where I was going at all. I'd never been to the South End.
Well, in those days, the housing mix, even the idea of what housing was meant for, was quite different in the South End. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, there were a lot of rooming houses. And cheap apartments. When I first moved into where I am now, still, I paid $65 a month for a very large apartment. And I always say, and for the Atlantic Monthly, my landlady left the Atlantic Monthly at my door. I mean, that's, and now that's unheard of. I heard a guy talking on the bus the other day about he used to live in the South End and he paid something like that. But now the average rent is $3,000 or more a month.
Well, in more recent times, it's not unusual for people in college or graduate school to be sharing an apartment with other people who are doing pretty much the same thing. But when you were in the South End, I think it was more motley, wasn't it?
Well, it depends. I mean, that's kind of the thesis of my book here. New people say the South End was a slum for 30, 40 years, whatever, many decades. And I lived there, and it wasn't a slum. Yeah, sure, a lot of places were run down and, didn't look the best, but it was a neighborhood. And
I think even when you were living in that first place, the mix of people in the building, they weren't all college students.
Oh, no, they weren't. Somebody was telling me about this, just maybe we were talking about it on the phone. Yeah, they were nurses, they were teachers, working women, single women. Yeah.
So what got you started? Because you put this timeline together. You must have spent an enormous amount of time just gathering things, almost hoarding in a way. Where did that begin exactly?
Well, what happened is that I'm on a committee at the South End Library, the South End History Committee, and we get books and articles and whatnot. At one point, about 5 years ago, we each decided to write a timeline of the South End. And it was short. They were very short, and everybody did it. We're 4 or 5 of us. And then I took them, and I said, oh, this needs more here, and that's not quite right. And all of a sudden, I was totally obsessed.
Of course, when you put this together, you see these things, they pile up one little thing on another. In one sense, it's kind of disjointed, but on the other hand, I think, don't things come together in a certain way, too, when you're doing these?
And I think that people tell me that it's really pretty amazing. You can open up at any page and find stuff that you never knew, and, you never knew that came before that, or that was in the same year, that kind of thing.
Well, you start pretty much around the year 1600.
Yes, 1600.
And I guess one of the things that people might be a little surprised if they don't know that far back in history is that the geography of the South End was quite different.
Right. Well, all it was called the Boston Neck. Boston proper was a very tiny little place, and the only land access was by this narrow neck that went to Roxbury mainland. And then over the years, they filled in both sides of the neck, and it became the South End.
And of course, that
Wait a
period
minute.
in history is maybe a little bit like the future, because as the ocean levels rise,
Right.
we'll get this flood-prone section of Boston again, I guess. Isn't that what's going to happen?
Well, it's not just the South End, right? It's already happened on the seaport.
Of course, when you write this book, and this is sort of a connection a bit to your own experience living in protected housing, there were other variants of that in the South End, including the
Yes.
place where Coretta Scott, the future Coretta Scott King, lived, isn't there?
That's right. She lived at the League of Women for Community Service on Mass Ave. She also lived on Beacon Hill in another kind of protected situation. And
And
yeah.
of course, this was an important neighborhood for the black community in Boston. And there are some figures, I've seen some of your writings over the years, there are some really interesting figures here that a lot of us outside the neighborhood have never heard of.
or overlook. Yeah. Well, the Harriet Tubman house, the original Harriet Tubman house on Holyoke Street, was that kind of place where they took in women, black women from the South, who maybe came here to be students and couldn't find another place to live.
And of course, some of the other figures here, even if they didn't live in the South End, there were important parts of their lives that took place in the South. I'm thinking of William Monroe Trotter,
Right,
and
right.
his confrontation with Booker T. Washington.
Right, the Boston riot. Right, well, he lived, that border between South End and Roxbury is a little shaky, and I consider him a South End resident on Kennard Street, I think it was.
Right. Of course, the other thing about the South End is that it was the epicenter for the jazz culture in Boston
Yes,
for
right.
many years.
Right.
Anything in your timelines about that?
Sure, everything's in my timeline. Nothing's left out.
Right.
Richard Vaca was very helpful. He wrote a book about Crosstown, about the jazz places. And he really did a lot of research.
And of course, that ripples out into other places, like Charlie's, where some of these people
Right.
would come and get breakfast, probably, right?
Right, right.
Of all the things in this history, I imagine maybe the one that you had to be most careful with in a way, and because it was just so complex, was urban renewal.
Yes, right.
What does your timeline do? Because do you start from New York streets and go up to what the city officially branded as?
Yeah,
urban?
around then it started, right. People don't know. People think in general that the West End was the first urban renewal demolition project, but it was actually the New York streets a few years before that.
Now, some people who are a lot younger than us, they may say, New York streets, what is that? Nowadays, it's the ink block. But,
Yes,
but before, long before it was the ink block, and even before it was the Boston Herald's plant, but what was there?
Housing, a neighborhood, a very mixed neighborhood, all kinds of people, Italians, Irish, Jewish, and they lived in smaller row houses than we see in a lot of parts of the South End.
Now, one of the figures who
Yes.
lived there that we've heard about a lot in the decades since
Yes.
is Mel King.
Right.
You must have quite a few entries about him in this book.
Yes, I do, right.
And what about the way the community processed urban renewal? Because this was not originally set up as doing a favor for people who lived in the South End. So tell us at least a little bit about that.
I think they meant it to be that way in a sense. But what I have about urban renewal is quite a bit, and it's mostly negative. It's mostly people saying, hey, this isn't what we want. And it was kind of crazy. There were several different plans for it, and
Now, I think at one time, the plan was to be a little bit like the West End, just demolish a whole bunch of buildings. Isn't it?
well, I think that never really started to happen. Of course, they demolished New York streets. And one of the things that I often heard in my earlier years in the South End was that, watch out, lady, because Boston City Hospital owns this property. You think, it isn't, but it is. And they're going to take it. But, actually, you said that I was forgetting something. One street that was taken by the hospital was,
Well,
Sharon Street.
okay.
Sharon Street. So I think that made people think it was going to be more than Sharon.
Of course, the other part of the story was that there was a lot of grassroots resistance, and people actually managed to change plans, and they did themselves a favor, something like with Via Victoria.
Right.
And what about leaders? Any neighborhood leaders that we should know about? I mean, they might be familiar to you and me, but some people who you think are really special.
Now?
Yes. Or even
a tough one.
In one of your timelines.
I don't know. There were so many key people. You know, one who I have a fairly big quote from is Albert Bohr, who was employed by United South End Settlements, or before that. And he really was prescient. I mean, he knew what was going to happen. And he said, and this was at the end of the 50s, 1960, he said, black people are being moved out. And, you know, he just saw it happening, and he really stated it. And other people did too, but I don't know if I'd say he was a leader. In a sense, he was.
Well, I did remember seeing one figure where something like 25,000 people were displaced from the South End during this period.
Yeah, but it was, well, not because their places were torn down.
No.
Right.
Of course, another big change in the landscape is the elimination of the elevated orange line in around 1987.
1987.
You tracked that quite a bit.
Yes.
Any highlights you can tell us about from the timelines?
Well, you know, I think about that L every single day when I take the Silver Line, which is supposedly its replacement, but really did not replace it. The L, you know, you could get on at Northampton Station and be downtown always in 10 minutes. There were no lights, there was no traffic. I mean, it was really an ideal form of transportation, I think.
Of course, the other thing going on here, and I know I saw this in one of the timelines, is that there were people at the grassroots level who were trying to make the best of the change.
Yeah.
I know Bob Terrell was put in charge of that.
Right. Well, I was on that committee, the Washington Street Corridor Coalition, and we worked very hard to find really good replacements. We had some technical people on the committee. We really knew what we were talking about, but no go.
Well, of course, the other thing that's been going on here is that a neighborhood that had a lot of, I guess, affordable bars has been turned into a neighborhood with a lot of pricey restaurants and bistros and cafes. You followed the cultural struggle around those places, and you've probably maybe been to some of them. What should we take from that?
I'm not sure I understand.
Well, I mean,
we used to have. Well, for instance, there's a guy who lives across the street from me who is from the South. He cannot believe that I ever went into Roscoe's Lounge. And I said, James, we had a great time in there, you know? And there's no place like that now. You can't just go to a neighborhood bar unless you spend a fortune. And I don't, you know.
No, as I say, it's a different world. We should mention that if people want to at least touch base with this history, you've got some copies of the book there. Maybe you can replenish. So if they want one, what's the best thing for them to do?
Well, I'm speaking in the South End at the South End Library on Tuesday, October 8th at, for some reason, 6:20.